is our 16th Ojai Chautauqua panel. And if you haven't been to a Chautauqua panel before, the intention is basically to try to remedy a situation that we find ourselves in, which is repeatedly people take sides, don't want to listen to the other side of any argument, and then if you're on social media, you don't know what to believe. You can find stories that reinforce your beliefs, but you're not sure about the facts. And so what we've attempted to do with this panel series is to take an issue that people are passionate about, let's say fracking or GMOs or our water situation in the valley, and get as many facts together as we can. Put a packet together, which you've got on your chair there, and not have a position, but to say, let's have an informed conversation so that we can all leave better understanding the other side, maybe better articulate our own beliefs about the subject. And it turns out we've seen so many wonderful experiences where people can get together, actually can make change very positively that we've seen since the beginning of this project in 2014. So that's the intention here, that we're in a new era in Ojai and in our state, which is legalize marijuana for medical use and then recreational, and then also having dispensaries in Ojai, as you know. So we want to look at many of those factors. Before I get to the panel, I want to outline a couple of things about this packet. So I'm just going to go through a couple pages so you understand. The first is, I'm not going to go in detail into the panelist biographies because you can read that for yourself. The content summary on page 4 in general, these are the questions that we are going to be going over. I've tried to, I love graphs like everybody else, so every time I found a graph, I included one that was clear, like which states have, decriminalized, recreational, and so on. But the ones that are harder, it's where you get to some of the articles, right? So if you get to page 8, this is from the Associated Press, and this is how California hasn't realized its tax revenue. That's the reasons why. And again, you can't see it so quickly in a chart, but here it is. Page 10, recently in the LA Times, about the growing nuts in Santa Barbara County and some of the controversy around that, which is something that we will want to look into. But then, of course, Sesame Creek Collective gave us 2 wonderful charts on page 11, which is what's the age range of people coming to the dispensary and by what region. So that's pretty clear. Now this is where it gets a little complicated, and again, I would love to have a chart that I can hand you to say bad, good. But life usually doesn't work like that. This is a 5-year Colorado study that we found, and we will put it on our website. It's a very lengthy PDF, but we tried to summarize it here. And the parts in bold, that's if you only have time to skim. I tried to highlight the words increased, stay the same, drop, and so on, with some visual graph. And the answer, most of the time, is that the results are sort of mixed. And that's why we're here, is to talk through some of these details, but I'll let you read for yourself what it is, and we're going to get into some of those things. So that's 4 pages of the Colorado study. Then about driving, trying to find on 17 a sort of a sweet spot between regulation and working towards that. And then from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, therapeutic effects, risk factors. Again, because of the structure of cannabis, the classification, there has not been the kind of studying that there hopefully will be in the future, but here's where we're at. Finally, from Health and Human Services on page 20, some of the risks of adolescent use, that's a factor that we will be considering, things like addiction and so on. Marijuana and the FDA, what has been approved so far, what's in the works, and what's their position. And then finally, sort of a history of cannabis in not only the United States but the world that we are going to get into with our first question. So that's the outline of the packet. On your chair, there is also a note card and some pens. So during the conversation, a question might occur to you. So what I would encourage you to do is to write down your question legibly, put your name on it, and about halfway through the event, I'll let you know we're going to come out and ask the questions. We'll have some volunteers go down the aisle, get your questions, and then they will be asked at the panelist towards the end of the event. With that, I want to introduce our panel, and I want to let you know, if you didn't know, these are all volunteers. They're volunteering their time and their expertise to help us all try to understand this issue. And I want to just first thank them for their time. have Dr. David Behrman on the far side there, who's going to talk about his expertise and as an author, an expert witness, etc. Ryan Black, who serves on our city council. Christopher Lynch, a local attorney. James Vaya, our police chief. Hopefully you don't know him that well, unless you're friends. Daniel Hicks with Ventura County Behavioral Health. And then Chelsea Satula, who is the owner of Sesame Creek Collective. Welcome to our panel. Okay, so Dr. Behrman, if you could briefly give us a history of legal cannabis in the United States, if you would.
Very happy to. Thank you for inviting me.
And get close to your microphone.
Okay, I appreciate being here and being able to have this conversation with everybody. I've delivered suggestions to Santa Barbara City Council, Goleta City Council, yada, yada, yada. One of the things that I'm afraid we may spend some time on, and I mentioned this to Mr. Gilman, is arguing about what are facts and what aren't facts. But when it comes to history, pretty much we can all agree on certain things. And I want to give you a couple of dates. 2637 BC, the 15th century, the 1804, 1839, 1865, the 1920s, 1937, 1942, 1969, and 1970. And these are some of the key dates in understanding the history of use of cannabis as medicine and regulations related to cannabis. The first sort of anti-cannabis statement was made by, I believe he was Pope Innocent VI in the 15th century, who accused midwives of witchcraft because they were using cannabis to ease the pain of childbirth. And we know that Eve was a punishment for Eve and all subsequent women, at least according to the Bible. Egypt had cannabis in its Materia Medica, which is a list of commonly used medications, starting with the Ebers Papyrus, probably before that. The Chinese, of course, beat them to that in 2637 BC with what's thought to be the first Materia Medica. Then, while cannabis remains used as a medication and also as a spiritual aid in the southeast and in India and as far as Egypt, it is used mainly in Europe as a food source. It's a principal ingredient to breakfast cereal. It was used in making beer, but not so much in medicine. In 1804, Napoleon's troops came back from Egypt and brought with them both the recreational medicinal use of cannabis to France. And in the 19th century, the majority of scientific papers on cannabis were written in French. In the 1860s, a nun who was up for sainthood named Mary Aubert introduced cannabis in New Zealand because she was an herbologist, not because she was an old hippie. In 1839, W.B. O'Shaughnessy, who was eventually knighted for putting the telegraph across India, had done some research with animals and then treated people in India, brought it back to England in 1839. From 1854 until 1942, cannabis was in the United States pharmacopoeia. A colleague of mine, Dr. Donald Abrams, who's a professor at UCSF, says except for the period from 1942 until 1996, cannabis has been medicine for 4,000 years. And a commonly used medicine, it was the third most common ingredient in prescription medication and over-the-counter medication at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So when the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 passed, you'll find all kinds of old over-the-counter preparations that contain cannabis that will tell you how much cannabis is in there. And it will say, approved by the FDA. They don't mean that the product was approved by the FDA, they mean the label was approved by the FDA. And in the 1920s, American physicians wrote 2 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis. In 1937, the AMA testified aggressively against the Marijuana Tax Act. Now, the most recent law has been the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. There was a committee that was formed as a result of that same legislation to study drug policy, and specifically cannabis drug policy, and they recommended legalizing small amounts of cannabis for recreational use. That recommendation was not implemented by the president at that time, who was Richard Nixon. And in fact, Nixon made cannabis a Schedule I drug, which means has no known medical use in the United States and has a high propensity for abuse and heroin. But according to an article that appeared in the Atlantic 2 years ago, written by, I've forgotten his name now, but a very famous writer who wrote Smoke and Mirrors. And he had interviewed John Ehrlichman in 1994, and Ehrlichman said the reason they made cannabis Schedule I was to marginalize the college students who were anti-war activists in the early 1970s. This is the reason we have some of the drug laws we have not too much to do with the drugs and quite a bit to do with politics. And I appreciate you giving me this time. I've got, if anybody's interested in history, I have this book here. It's 500 pages long, and I promise to only go through halfway here. So.
Let me just ask you one follow-up question. What was the main impetus to get it, at least in California, legal for medical purposes? What caused that to be?
Well, the physician who was most responsible for that is Todd McCorea, who since passed away from liver cancer. Dr. McCorea has long been a proponent of medicinal cannabis, and he was very knowledgeable. He had read the India Hemp Commission report, which is 8 volumes of 3,300 pages. And he was, for a short time, in charge of approving grants for studying cannabis for the National Institute of Mental Health. But he was at odds with the leadership who were interested in having studies to show the harm of cannabis, whereas he was interested in looking at the medical aspects of it. A guy named Dennis Perrone was really given the credit for spearheading this back in 1996, and it was because of the recognition that cannabis was useful in treating symptoms related to HIV/AIDS and the treatment of HIV/AIDS, and in fact that prompted the federal government to encourage the development of THC, which is one of the things I wanted to mention. One of the things we get excited about is the euphoria caused by THC, and yet we have had Marinol, which is synthetic THC, on the market since 1985, and it's available all over Ojai, in every one of your CVS's and every one of your drugstores. If they don't have Marinol, they can get it. And so one of the things that I think that we're dealing with is the word marijuana, which, by the way, when the AMA testified against the Marijuana Tax Act, said, we hope you don't pass this over the objection of the AMA, but if you do, don't call it the Marijuana Tax Act because nobody knows what you're talking about.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me go to the next question. And Ryan, I'd like to start with you. Why did Ojai decide to allow first dispensaries in the Ontario County?
Well, I want to make one thing clear. I wasn't on the council when that decision was made.
Right.
But I have been on, and we've been looking at that decision as we move forward, because there's been some recent things. So I'm going to describe what happened first, and I'll describe then what's happened more recently. The Ojai had a really unique situation that didn't occur anywhere else in the county. Ojai had allowed, the council at the time believed, and I agree with, that we needed access for medicinal cannabis use in Ojai. This was before it was passed as a legal recreational use. This was just for medicinal use. And the council was concerned about access in our community, given where Ojai is located, and that there were a number of patients who came in and said we need access. So there were licensed medicinal dispensaries that were open. Subsequent to that, the district attorney's office in Ventura County decided to prosecute those medicinal dispensaries and close them down. So there was no longer any access available. It was then passed where it was recreationally legal. And unlike what most cities did, where they would put it on a ballot, have a tax pass, then decide if the local government or the local people wanted it, the council said, and again I agree with this, they said, look, we're not going to wait. Our patients don't have access right now. The word is clear, this is going to be legal recreationally as well as medicinally, and we do not want there to be any problem with access anymore. So we're going to move quickly and allow the first dispensaries that are allowed in Ventura County. And they did that with some caveats. They're very smart about it. They said, we're not going to do licenses, or we're not going to do permits. We're going to do a form of an annual renewable license so that the council stays in control of ever wanting to change its mind. So these licenses are on an annual basis. They have to be renewed annually, and they're not automatic moving forward. They also limited it to 3. They wanted to create some competition in the market, but not have too much. 3 was the number that was landed on, and so far that's been an appropriate number. As we move forward, there was a request from some of the dispensaries to expand a little bit into the other parts of the cannabis marketplace. And not cultivation, I want to make that clear. Ojai has from the very beginning said we are not going to allow cultivation, and that has not been revisited or discussed any further. But there are 3 other parts of the business that exist. There is the retail business, or what you hear is the dispensaries, which you know exist in Ojai now. And then there's distribution and there's manufacturing. And distribution is essentially moving the products around, and manufacturing is taking the products and making different things than the flower that you would commonly know as marijuana or cannabis. Putting it in concentrate, making different edible products or drinking products, all those other types of things. So what we've done recently is we've allowed the industry to expand a little bit. We have allowed distribution and manufacturing to go on as well. And we are putting a ballot measure on the November 2020 ballot that will be up to the citizens of Ojai decide if we are going to allow a tax on all the cannabis activity. And the tax, what we're looking at would be up to 10% tax, but it would start at 3%. But it gives us the authority to move that number around as a council as we see fit down the road, and essentially would give us some tax revenue, a significant increase in the tax revenue we're going to get. Under the current system, we don't have any additional taxes. We're the only community I'm aware of that's allowed dispensaries that doesn't have an additional local tax. And our local tax, the only way we derive any money from the cannabis industry now is through the portion of regular sales tax that the city receives, which I believe is either 1 to 1.5%. So it's very minimal compared to a lot of the other communities. The 3% we're looking at is less than, for example, Port Wayne, which has a 5% tax. So that's where we currently are looking forward. But the reason that we didn't have those taxes first is that unique situation in Ojai that the council was very concerned about cannabis access and local citizens because they had it and it was taken away. And subsequent to that, those prosecutions have been stopped. Chelsea can talk more about that. She was one of the individuals who was involved with that.
You may have said this and I missed it. On the manufacturing licenses, is there a limit of 2 right now?
Yeah, it's a little confusing. The way it works is and I don't want to get too in the weeds about how the regulations work because it's a very complicated regulatory industry. But there's micro businesses that have dispensaries and none. So the micro businesses, so the current dispensaries can add the distribution and manufacturing. And then there's the ability for individuals to create standalone distribution and manufacturing, limited to 2 standalones and up to the current dispensaries want to, that all 3 of them can complete what's called a micro business.
Okay. Does anybody else want to respond to that question? Why Ojai first?
I just want to say one thing on tax. I understand you say you have no tax, and that's the way it should be for all medicinal. The idea that we tax medicine is ridiculous, and I applaud the city of Ojai for having to force it.
Well, I don't believe there is a sales tax on marijuana sales. There's only a sales tax on recreational.
Right.
You have to have it. You have to have it.
Well, so everybody understands that, Chelsea, you can correct me on this. I believe that if you have a medicinal card, when you go into even a dispensary, there is a tax. They treat the taxes differently than if you go in as just an individual going in there to purchase recreational. So if you do have medicinal access, then you should not get taxed those additional taxes like the sales.
There's
Or with our
like 2
local tax.
layers in medicinal access. There's people with a normal recommendation from a typical doctor saying, yes, this person would benefit from medical cannabis as a recommendation letter. To have any tax benefit, you have to take that letter go to the county health office, get an appointment, pay $150, I think, dollars, I can't remember,
Right.
and wait for them to send a card in the mail that's renewable on an annual basis. So you actually need 2 levels of that medical authorization to qualify for any tax benefit. The majority of medical recommendation holders that we see do not fulfill that additional obligation with the county for financial and convenience reasons.
Yeah, I vehemently agree with Chelsea. I just want to point out that is a state program,
Yeah.
medical cannabis card program that's
So,
administered by
county.
public health.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. What have been the benefits and downsides of legal cannabis and having dispensaries in Ohio? You talked about the tax revenue already, Ryan, a little bit. Is there a number just so far that you could pull out of the air about what Ohio's benefited?
Well, I can't exactly, I don't know if we even know all of, it hasn't been going on very long, and the state tax money that comes through sales tax gets delayed when it comes back to the city significantly. So we did see data from Q3 of 2018, which was the first almost full quarter of cannabis activity, but it was very early in the situation. So we do have some projections, but other than the ones that are included in some of the information that we have to the council, which we've had some all over the place, some of the other data is private, and I'm not sure. Because we do remind some of them.
One of the things that I'd like to mention in terms of money is that there's a study done by Bradford demonstrating that $1 billion has been saved in Medicaid and Medicare costs just by the states that have legalized medicinal cannabis. That's one point. The other point is that it's really expensive to throw people in jail for life at $40,000 a year, particularly if their last crime was having a half an ounce of cannabis. And hopefully we won't see that anymore as a result of these laws. And so when we take a look at the total balance sheet for the city, you have to look at just more than taxes, and I'm sure that you can tell us more about that.
Well,
Yes, please.
I'd like to jump in with, and maybe...
And if you turn it, you can raise it, here you go.
I have a long torso. All right, let's just do this.
Okay.
How's that?
Great.
Good. So on page 17, there's a graphic that I'd like to point out to folks, and it's not an absolute graph, but it kind of sums up where I'm coming from with respect to theory of regulation. And I will say from the outset that I'm a short-term pessimist and long-term even more pessimist when it comes to doing things right within the legal and regulatory structure. And I say that because of our vast experience in the United States with alcohol, coming out of prohibition and ending up with what you probably best describe as the far right side of that graph. So some of my comments today are going to come from the place of options and the importance of local control. I think it's critically important that municipalities in California exercise and protect the local powers that are afforded under the passage of Prop 64. And we already have begun to see an erosion of local powers. And from where I come from the prevention business, you could point to alcohol as a great example of moving from prohibition on the far left through decriminalization and harm reduction strategies to some sort of regulatory structure where I think we are getting closer to, as far as cannabis in California, and particularly in our driest of the Southern California counties heretofore. But I see a danger, and I think there are other panelists who see it too, that with the risk of conglomeration, we can go further to the right and undo a lot of the protections that exist for folks at the local level. One case in point, I and others who provided input to the California Behavioral Health Directors Association wanted the Blue Ribbon Commission that was put together by Gavin Newsom to take into account lessons learned from alcohol policy when it comes to protecting the young developing brain. There's a pretty good body of research about it's not binary. It's not alcohol good, alcohol bad. It's alcohol during brain development in heavy doses is long-term bad. Same can be said of cannabis. And what we found was it was kind of hard to get into that discussion and bring the protections that we thought ought to have been considered in the legislation as it finally worked its way through. And so the way I see it, just so everyone knows where I'm coming from, is local control was paramount. And we have a very narrow plan for protecting our communities, and in particular, protecting vulnerable members of our community, people who have a family history of psychiatric problems, and young people whose brains are still developing. So what I favor is what you'd see in the middle of that graph, which is responsible, local, and legal regulation. And I put an emphasis on local only because the history with alcohol, tobacco, and we go into other areas, is that local control is eroded or attacked as you get a bigger and bigger multinational organizations that put stockholders over stakeholders.
I have to jump in here. Remember I said I would probably go after people when they didn't use accurate science. And unless you're intimately familiar with the work that Sarah Barnes-Torres did at Columbia regarding the effect of cannabis in utero, I don't think you have a leg to stand on. And also, I think you need to be familiar with the work that was done by Melanie Dreyer, who is now the Dean of the School of Nursing at Rush Medical School, in which children and women who used cannabis during pregnancy met their developmental landmark sooner and achieved higher grades than the children and women who didn't use cannabis during pregnancy. Now, when she corrected for educational level, which was a little bit higher for the cannabis users, there was no difference. And when you go to the developing brain, the fact of the matter is that there was a pretty good study that was done in collaboration between UCLA and University of Minnesota on twins. And they found that the twin who did not use cannabis, that their IQ went down 4. And the twin who did use cannabis, their IQ went down 4. So the point that I'm trying to make is that our IQ is affected by many, many variables, and none of the studies that are out there, other than maybe the UCLA Minnesota study, correct for these other variables. And so you're not just on weak ground. You don't have any real solid science to stand on. And I think if you're looking for local regulation, and I'm a local elected official in Santa Barbara, I believe in local control. And I think that you should do that, but when you do it, you ought to make sure that you're operating on real science, not just science that's been promulgated by NIDA. And I mean, don't get into NIDA.
Yeah, I completely agree about the limitations of our government, our federal government's history, particularly in the last 50, 60 years of funding research. It's been abysmally poor, and I would agree with you in that. I was referring specifically to the Dunedin study out of New Zealand and the longitudinal tracking of people of use of cannabis throughout their lifetime. And we get some pretty, not pretty, very solid results from that. And in Dr. Meyer, who was referenced in the National Institute of Drug Abuse summary of that study, can speak to it more. Oh, by the way, I'm an identical twin, and we can have a great conversation after this.
All right.
Not admitting to it. So the other thing is, so since you brought it up, Doctor, I will just say, I have been paying more and more attention to research that's done outside of the United States, in particular Israel, and then recently in Germany. And I would just, if the moderator will indulge me, I just want to read from the recent Scientific American. In 2016, Andreas Zimmer from the University of Bonn in Germany gave low doses of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, to young and then mature and then aged mice. Understand limits of transferability from mice to humans, but as expected, young mice treated with THC performed slightly worse on behavioral tests of memory and learning. But what I want people to know about where I'm coming from is that's not the end of the story. And Dr. Behrman has pointed out before that there are neuroprotective properties of cannabis that we have been at a disadvantage in our country to understand. The story goes on to point out, the research shows that the senior mice, the more aged mice, with low doses of THC perform much better later in the study, so much so that they are closer in their performance to the young mice who are untreated. So my point here is that I agree with you. The research you look at is really important, but it is never a binary, it's good or it's bad. It's what's right for whom, and then how do we protect against those actors.
One of the other things I would say is simply,
But brief, Dr. We have to move on, so give a brief response.
all I want to say is that the city should put money towards research.
Can I
Well,
just speak
please,
to
go
the
ahead.
point about local control actually? Because local control was one of the main reasons that Prop 64 was passed. But unfortunately, as you can see by the graph on page 7, what many cities and counties in California have chosen to interpret local control to be is local prohibition. And so you go back to the Daniel's graph about the harm reduction and social harms of prohibition. What you get is an unregulated criminal market, and that's exactly what's taking place right now. Everywhere there's no licensed dispensaries, what you have are unlicensed delivery services. And so just the point on tax revenue, and we'll talk about it later, why is it falling short? It's because we have local prohibitions still largely in effect in Ventura County, and that results in a large segment of cannabis users turning to the unlicensed, untaxed market.
That's, so the chart that's on page 8, is that tell me if I'm wrong, that's showing the cities in California that either are not allowing dispensaries, allowing it, or they're silent on the subject, so still a vast majority not allowing it.
Yeah.
I'd just like to follow up on what Chelsea says. I sometimes wonder about even the relevance of the discussion of whether it's healthy or not
A
healthy,
little closer to your microphone.
whatever whatever research says regarding these effects. From what I see is that it's in use, whether it's legal or it's illegal, it's in use. So, there's unlimited access when it's illegal. You can smoke it anytime you want, any age you want, it happens. So, the problem with the state level control is that it has the same mentality as the federal, and that is the whole notion of control, to the point where you're going to crush the legitimate businesses and the black market will thrive. So I think the debate that goes on and on about the health, I think the medical benefits and all these sort of things that are important, research should be done, we should know how to label, how to process, how to administer doses, all that makes a difference. But in regulating a business activity that is trying to take over for the benefit of the community from a black market illegal activity, then we need to focus on how do we make those businesses successful. I think that should be the focus, and not this idea we have to control everything, because any of this assumes that making it illegal and all the control that's been put on achieved any of these aims that we're talking about. Restricting underage use, restricting traffic, DUIs, any of this stuff is going to happen regardless. So I think the focus needs to change, and I really support the idea of local control embodied in Prop 64, because that's where you can make these businesses successful and safe and a benefit to the community and replace illegal activity.
I would love to hear from you, James.
All right, so my opinion, right, so to be very clear, I'm 100% anti-marijuana, right? I've said this many times during our council meetings,
What does that mean?
that I'm against marijuana, period.
You don't
That's my
like it for
philosophical,
cancer?
it's my philosophical objection, and I have that right. I voted no on Prop 64.
That's-
However, we have it now, and as your chief, my job now is to find a way to keep our community safe with whatever decisions that the council makes that are now legal. Prop 64 passed, marijuana is now legal, and I have no interest in making it illegal, right? It's a legal substance, whatever the benefits are, hopefully at some point as a nation we can then advance to where we can do actual studies to find out in what dose it's valuable, what properties within the THC or marijuana plant are valuable. Marijuana produced today is substantially different than it was 30 years ago, much higher concentrations. We have no idea yet, because the studies haven't been done by this country yet, on what the continual use of cannabis at those levels does to the human body. There's so much that we don't know, and I think that's what's being lost in the conversation here of this study and that study in this country and that country is there's way more about what this property has available that we don't know that's dangerous. So I think that for me, I'm a cautionary person, is perhaps we should look at some research on the medical side, right? The reality is now, I'm going to stop on the medical work, that's something that as a country we should do. But then when we look at, okay, what have we done as a state that's hurt us? Number one, the decriminalization of drugs in general, including marijuana, back in even '94 when the Compassionate Use Act passed, there wasn't a whole lot of law enforcement being done on marijuana possession, right? If somebody was selling, it got more attention, right? But the reality is that the general user that was doing it for medicinal purposes was not drawing the ire of law enforcement because it was so decriminalized even at that point it wasn't worth our time to do. Unfortunately, with some of the laws that have passed, it's under that same thing now. Possession of marijuana is legal. Buying marijuana from an unlicensed dispensary is illegal, right? The person that's selling it, that's an illegal black market activity, but it's still just a misdemeanor. That really, we have not yet seen anybody have the appetite to file charges on people for a misdemeanor illegally selling marijuana. Now, one of the discussions that I've had, or at least I had with a former city manager, was about local control and regulating. What can we regulate and do that's got some teeth to it? Anybody here in the room familiar with our social host ordinance?
James, let me ask you one thing. Will you jiggle your cable? Because it looks like your mic's not on, but maybe there's just a little short.
I'll use Dan's. Apparently nobody really wanted to hear from me anyway. So the social host ordinance, for those that don't know, was an ordinance designed to get parents or other people that are homeowners to not allow underage kids to gather and drink alcohol. It created a civil assessment penalty for those that chose to allow underage drinking in their homes. One of the things that we should be looking at is doing the same thing with marijuana. We just add that to our social host ordinance from a party standpoint for underage kids that are at a house, having a party where they're using alcohol and or cannabis, and then handle it as a civil penalty rather than a criminal penalty. I agree that we don't need them in our jail system, but make it a fine so that we get people to comply. Illegal deliveries are also the same way. Right now, the state has allowed deliveries anywhere in the counties or anywhere in the state by licensed dispensaries. So a licensed dispensary in Oxnard can deliver to Ojai. Well, if we had ordinances that said you had to have a business license here, then at least Ojai would get some benefit from that as well. And then also, if we had an ordinance that said we're going to have basically a social host violation if you are delivering marijuana without a local license or you're not from a licensed dispensary, that comes with a fine. So maybe it's a licensed dispensary since they're already meeting all the state regulations, the fine amount is only $500, you're not getting a permit. But for those that are operating outside the bounds, where they're selling products that are untested, unregulated, untaxed, then we hit them hard and you get a $2,500 fine. Then when we set up our sting operations and we get them for doing it, we don't send them to jail for selling weed, we fine them because that's what they're doing, is they're benefiting on the money end of it. The reality is, to Dan's point on trying to reduce access to minors, our dispensaries already do that. They don't sell to anybody that unless they have a medical marijuana dispensary or they're 21 and over. So, yeah, there's some arguments on whether the brain development to 20 to 25 or so. I come in contact with a lot of people. I'm going to say there's some that are later than 25 before brain development occurs. But beyond that, it's up to them, right? So here's where we want to try and weigh it is, the black market is still the market that's providing access to the children. So that's the area where we need to really focus on, or maybe even the state needs to change the law saying that now that we have licensed dispensaries, maybe create a cutoff for the law that makes us different penalty for people who are operating outside of that bound, because the two properties are not equal. So I think local control is important. I think the city has a lot that they can do to add to that local control. I think our dispensaries have done a fine job of making sure that they're only selling to people that are allowed to have it. Like I said, I may be anti-marijuana, I'm not anti-business. And I understand that it's not my decision. The state voted it in, it's legal.
Can I go back to you though? I want to ask you, since the dispensaries have been in place, have you noticed any difference in terms of crime or adolescent use in Ohio at all?
Very complicated question, right? I'm going to give you a more complicated answer, right? There's no way to tell what the impact is. And this is for a lot of reasons. When we look at theft, or we arrest somebody for theft or other crimes, we don't test to see if the person's under the influence of marijuana. So I'll never know what the history of crime was compared to what it is now, and whether or not marijuana played an impact in that, right? Did our crime go up last year? Yeah. Not by much. And was it the result of the dispensaries? Probably not, right? It wasn't, there was no correlation that I can attribute from our dispensaries. We've had very few calls for service at our dispensaries. We've had one burglary at one of our dispensaries, which we can talk about security. When we first went down this path of opening dispensaries, I made a trip down to San Diego and visited a couple of different dispensaries down there that had highly regulated security concerns down there. I went with the chief of police from Port Hueneme, Andrew Sane. And what we decided was we wanted to make sure that our security that we had here locally was going to be consistent with what the rest of the state was doing. So if you go to a dispensary down in Port Hueneme, you'll see what security looks like, because they authorized the security to be that way. Our city did not adopt that, and so we have very minimal security requirements at our dispensaries. What we benefit from in Ojai that a lot of other places don't is it's very difficult to get into, and more importantly, out of Ojai. Anybody here come home late at night from work? You ever been stopped by like 5 deputies because you're going one way out of town? Well, that happens for everybody, right? There's a benefit to our community that people know that they cannot just come here and commit crime because they're not going to get out. I can shut the valley down with 2 stops.
Because nobody's going to try and get away to Lockwood, because I have about 3 hours to call those guys. So it's really not going to take very long to shut the exit points off to get people who have committed crime here. So we have the benefit of a very safe area because of that, which is geographically undesirable to come commit crime at. Having said that, had we had the security measures that I had originally asked for in place, we would not have even had the one burglary that we did. But having said that, they've been open for 1.5 years, and we've only had 1 burglary. Mm-hmm. Some other things that have occurred contemporaneous to marijuana legalization are some other propositions that have negatively affected our ability to keep people in jail. The realignment, AB 109, when the three-court panel said the conditions in our state prisons are tantamount to cruel and unusual punishment, you need to reduce your jail population. So what they did is they didn't just release the prisoners from state prison, they sent them to our county jail. So our county jail had to then release all our low-level offenders because we didn't have room for them. And then Prop 47 and 57 passed, which changed the structure of, where basically decriminalized drugs. Possession of heroin is a misdemeanor, right? That was under the Safe Schools and Neighborhoods Act. That law that passed does not allow us, we give them a ticket now. You're in possession of heroin, you're getting a ticket. You're high on heroin, you're gonna get a ticket. And as a result of not having a consequence of going to jail, fewer and fewer people, and this is not the only reason, maybe there's another reason, but I guess I can't say specifically this is what it is, but because there's no longer jail, fewer people are going into treatment. And at the end of the day, I think that's what we're all hoping for, and if you've ever had a family member who's been addicted to any substance, your only goal is that they go to treatment, because that can't be forced, they have to want it on their own. And even if they want it on their own, they're gonna fail many times before they get clean. So we need to make sure that we're giving people the opportunity to get the treatment they need. Our jails actually provide that. Unfortunately, they don't go there anymore. But our jails actually have very good treatment facilities and treatment counseling available for people that are in our jail system. They don't just get there and bang a tin can against the bars. That's not how it is.
Mr. Moderator?
Yes.
I mean, this is a great campaign speech, and I mean, I'd love to debate the chief one-on-one. I couldn't disagree more with most of what he said. First off, in regards to the laws having anything to do with preventing youngsters from using cannabis, that's ridiculous. If you take a look at the use of cannabis in Portugal and the Netherlands and high school students. It's less than in the United States when cannabis was illegal here. What it does is it creates unnecessary and expensive consequences for youth, particularly youth of color. And I mean, you made a very good case for the city council increasing your budget, but I don't think you made a very good case for the discussion that we're having here today. It seemed to me a generic kind of law enforcement response. I mean, when we're talking about substance abuse, pardon me, that's a medical problem. I'll take it in the doctor's office, and you have to have, I've had 50 years experience doing drug abuse treatment and prevention, so I mean, we don't have to agree, but I think I have some experience to base this on, and people come and see you for a variety of reasons. Very rarely have I seen it because they were arrested. It may be because arrested make their life miserable, and they no longer want their life to be miserable.
Let me just stop you guys. Please respond, but then Dan, I would love to hear if you have seen a difference in the county, but please respond and then go on.
So I'm not a proponent of making it illegal. I'm not saying that we need to haul people off to jail for marijuana use. That's not what I said at all.
Mm-hmm.
What I said was that we should create policies that deter people from using the illegal market so we can guide them towards the legal market of the tested products that we have. There are a lot of products out there that are not tested right now, that are unsafe, and that are being loaded with other things that people don't want to have. They just don't know they're using, including fentanyl, that are causing overdoses in our county, in our country. There's a lot of issues that are taking place. I'm not the one that's saying here we're going to make this criminalized. It's legal.
Dr. Behrman, let me hear from Dan.
No, if that's really your point, last point I wanted to make on that is that one of the things that I came here to say is that we need more testing, and it sounds to me like you and I are on the same page on that. And I was just had a guest, a member of the state advisory board, who held a hearing on labs, and the lab people say that they can't test this stuff.
Right.
They're not treating it like a plant. They're trying to treat it like a single molecule thing. So, and the other thing in regards to dispensaries that I want to say is, I'm all for treating cannabis like medicine, and I think that the state has been way too liberal. They should require the dispensaries to be supervised by a physician, and they should not allow recommendations via Skype. So, I mean, I have certain concerns as well in terms of the way things are improperly regulated.
Okay, just real quick, and then I'll let Dan talk.
Yeah.
But we're well beyond this being a medical issue, right? I know that there's a lot of issues, a lot of studies that could be done to determine what the true medical benefit is. But we are in a recreational state now. They don't need to have a doctor at a dispensary. People now can make the decision if they want to use or not. If they're 21 and over, you don't have to have a medical need. You can go get weed.
So
Yep.
you have that effect. Or they turn you off.
You know what it is? It's that steel grip of the law. You crush the microphone.
So if you visit a website, VenturaCountyLimits.org, there you will find the summary of 5 different federally funded research studies, not about cannabis, but about alcohol and youth access to alcohol. And I bring that up because we know what the best practices are on a population basis to limit youth access. And as the doctor says, criminalizing approaches to health problems is not the way to go. Suddenly back on. So there are a number of things that are really clear from the research, and one of those things that may apply to cannabis that comes from the alcohol research is that youth access, especially as a market gets more developed and the industry gets more robust, is that you could put it under the heading of trust but verify. You need to have people go into establishments and see how those operations actually are happening and how age of sale is enforced. And you have to have, again, I would say, local accountability. It is in some ways like retailers in the alcohol industry. We have a good history of working closely with retail alcohol establishments to support local health and safety, including preventing youth access. If we don't have that kind of, Anheuser-Busch does not care what you think of the Super Bowl ads that they run. That level is not what we're talking about. We're talking about local accountability at the retailer level. So I've never heard any of our local dispensary operators say, don't regulate us, don't give us more rules. Actually, what I've heard them say is, make the rules responsible and let us know how we can comply. And so youth access is a much broader topic than just cannabis, and I would agree that a completely criminalized approach is not going to do anything to reduce age of first use. In our county, just to be clear, the average age of first use is 13 years of age, and 71% of our young people who come into treatment into our system, their drug of choice, 71% is cannabis. That means we're trying to help them end a problematic use of cannabis. But that's not to say that that cannabis use has gone up since legalization. What we've seen actually is a plateau or a slight decrease in the levels of adolescent cannabis use. I will just so we're all clear, everyone on the panel and in the audience, what I'm worried about is early and frequent heavy use of alcohol or cannabis or any drug while the adolescent brain is in development. That's where I'm coming from. And as the research that I cited from Germany suggests, there's a difference between a 13-year-old brain and a 50-year-old brain and a 78-year-old brain. And so our discussions about effective deterrence probably should be left for another time. But I do think that it's important to point out is the questions that we have, what are the challenges facing the industry? I would say one of the challenges facing the industry is how to have meaningful and robust compliance so we don't go down the path that we did with alcohol post-prohibition. You want to talk about youth access to alcohol, take a look at the levels of young people, fights, injuries, different drug, different pattern of behavior, but still, if we're concerned about youth access, we need to have partnerships or alliances with local accountability among our industry, our dispensaries and delivery services.
Chelsea, can I ask
What
you
I
to-
think the industry should do to deal with this is to support parenting, because I would venture to guess that a lot of the people that come to you have attention deficit disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, and the community approach that I advocate is to increase parenting and increase the parental responsibility of putative fathers and unwed mothers. And I'll shut up, but I think that's a real key issue.
Thank you. But Chelsea, I wanted you to confirm or disavow what Dan said about welcoming regulation.
Yeah, I begged for a regulation from 2013 to 2016, and that's a long story. But yes, we were basically asking cities in the county to please regulate us, tax us. We want to be normal. We want to be here providing a service to the community that we knew was needed, because we had people already. I mean, it was operating under the gray, weird rules of SB 420, and then the state put rules in place, and then the people of California voted for Prop 64. So I think at this point, it's a matter of talking about over-regulation at the state level. I think the whole track and trace system is going to be put to the test. I think they're already discussing getting rid of it in Washington. Because it's tied to some really poor performing software developers. If the system goes down, no sales can take place.
Explain that in more detail. I don't know if everybody knows that system.
So the system it's the one that California decided to contract with is called Metric. It's based in Florida. They have contracts in a couple other states. I want to say Oregon and Colorado and probably Florida. Anyway, it's an ancient system. I had to hire additional staff to deal with the administrative burden of getting on board the system. Because as a retailer, I'm coming on, even though I'm at the end of the supply chain, the timing of this is such that they haven't timed it appropriately, and to get the beginning of the supply chain coming up and then I'm the end, I was at the end. It's just a disaster. Talk to anybody in the industry. Right now, they're going through a transition phase. Everybody's temporary licenses are expiring at the end of this month. So the track and trace system will be in full effect sometime around the end of August, early September. And that's when we can really start kind of testing out if this is going to be a total nightmare or not, because it's gone down. If the system got, power outage, whatever, systems go down, right? Facebook goes down. Oh my God, everybody's panicking and on Twitter, right? So if that happens in your industry, this is the system that requires us to report every sale at our dispensary level every day, at the end of the day. The cultivators report, okay, I just cut a harvest down and it's in this lot and it's got this tag on it. Every plant has an RFID tag attached to it from the nursery. And that's followed up through the batch level, through the lot level, through manufacturing, testing, distribution to the retail level. So that, God forbid, if somebody's chocolate cookie, has a tiny bit of mold in it, which shouldn't happen because it passed a lab test for all those things to begin with, we can track that back and do a recall. And so far, there's been a few voluntary recalls based on something was wrong on the package label. There was a 2 instead of a 6 or something. I just see the effects of overregulation at this point, because I don't really see the public health and safety being benefited by all this additional layer of regulation. The state's barely able to keep up with it. They don't have enough staff in place. There's like an 80% vacancy level at the Bureau. They don't return phone calls. It's just it's a giant mess, because I think they put too much in place. They made it really, really expensive for companies to get on board and get into the system. If you can even get a license or permit in your city and county, if they're even willing to play the game, you have to jump through an obscene amount of hoops. All the packaging changes, child-resistant packaging. Most of the people that are in our dispensary are over 45. A good percentage of them have issues with arthritis and they can't get in, and they need our help to get in the package, which we can't legally do in the dispensary. It's silly. It's actually hurting a lot of people to have child-resistant packaging. It's hurting our planet to have child-resistant packaging. So I think the state's going to have to reconsider a couple of these rules to come in line with, this is why we're losing money. This is,
I just want to clarify that what I was saying before is I've never heard you bristle at the need for local, what the local regulations are. I'm sure you're not welcoming more and more state level regulation. And I think I just want to chime in, and I'll pass the mic, is, one of the things we learned from alcohol policy is that state level regulation does become a nightmare, and there's lots to not like. And I see some nodding heads. There's lots to not like about how state level alcohol rules are set, revenues are taken in, and enforcement takes place. So, and even with respect to youth access and irresponsible retailers. So I just wanted to be clear. I'm not. I know you don't want all the regulation you can handle. I think, again, local is always better.
Yeah, and I would just agree. Local regulation to me means how many dispensaries, where can they be located, what can their hours of business be, who are the operators that we're going to allow. Those are the kind of things that should be in place. But I would just say local banning across the board is not what the state had in mind, and it's not what the voters voted for.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges, like Chelsea had mentioned, is that the state is really behind on hiring the people necessary to have this be really an effective scheme business, right? I mean, they put all these regulations in and didn't have the infrastructure to handle the regulations that they've placed. The track and trace is not only to make sure for the recall, it's also to make sure that the cultivators are operating legally as well, right? It's making sure that every part of the system is licensed and regulated by the state, although they probably bid with a low contract, with the low bidder, right? So they got the outdated software and they paid the lowest amount to have this done. So it's a necessary evil for what it is now, and hopefully will improve so that it's not a matter of having to shut sales down. Especially with, the require for recording everything that's happening in your shop, those things, at some point, I'm sure the state will have to look at deregulating some of what they've added. But from the local control standpoint, I think we've talked about things that we could do locally to make things better, to help eliminate some of the black market issues that are downing the business, right? And to be able to really help the people that are doing it properly, that have the licenses, to be able to exceed and excel the way they're supposed to. And I think just the state was so far behind in all their process on this that it really hurt. That's why their market's not being met. When you look at their taxation numbers and how far below the mark they are, it's just because they weren't prepared for, number one, to be able to issue licenses, and then number two, they weren't prepared for the number of cities that were going to say, by local control means prohibition.
I think that the stigma, the historical stigma that we've had, have caused us to turn ourselves into pretzels here. I mean, from 1854 until 1942, cannabis was dispensed in drugstores, and according to the AMA knew of no problems from the medicinal use of cannabis. I do not think that our pharmacists are dumber now than they were then, and I don't know why the state legislature can't take a look at the pharmacy regulations they have and apply most, if not all of them, to dispensaries. I recognize this is a plant, and there's some things that are unique, but it seems to me that we maybe are going out of our way to make this more complicated than it needs to be. And I like the fact that the councilman talked about this is a business. And it's hard for me to get my head around it. And I understand where the chief is coming from, I think, in that we're still stuck back 20 years ago when this was illegal. And I think the point of this meeting is to say, okay, it's legal, and we all recognize that at one level, but I think at the policy level, we're still struggling.
Just a program note, I would point out that we squandered in California some very precious time. 20 years ago, cannabis was legal under the compassionate use in 1996, and we could have used that time, and I think we all agree, to better understand and prepare for whatever vision the populace wanted when we came up to 2016. And I think it's a sad statement, of how we do policy and how we treat a highly stigmatized, product. It's not an ordinary commodity. It's a very special commodity, and it needs to be treated with respect. But in those 20 years, from 1996 to 2016, there sure is a lot of stuff that could have gotten done that was not done, clearly, and we could have avoided some of the, dare I say, train wreck that we have now from a regulatory and local control standpoint.
Thank you. Ryan, let me just ask you one question before we transition. Is it the city's perspective that that the city has proceeded cautiously and generally happy with the results so far?
Yeah, the city's been very happy, partly because, and I want to make this really clear, we have a really great police chief who is willing to swallow his personal opinion and do a great job for the city because we make the policy, he follows it, and he's done a fantastic job working with the dispensaries to make sure that was done. We've also had some really good dispensaries. Chelsea's a fantastic partner with the city, and we've been really lucky to have that. And in Ojai, one part of the secret sauce for a lot of things that work is we have a lot of really great people. Having bad actors, having a different community where people weren't accountable to each other would make it a different situation. We might not be able to have some of the luxuries we have about people really trying to do the right thing and grow this together, and we're really trying to create that partnership. So far there haven't really been, we've had, there's been 2 council members who were not for the dispensaries in the first place. I don't know if they've changed their minds, but they have not been aggressively against it. And all the reports we've gotten back from school district, police department, everywhere, we haven't had any serious complaints. Where we're moving to next is what we want to, really it's that next step, is that we want to make sure we haven't had the funding to do some of the local accountability stuff that we've been able to do before, and we want this to not only be a partnership, but to be able to help the community as it's helping these businesses, but also that we can use some of that money to make sure that that accountability is there moving forward.
Thank you. So Chelsea, I wanted to go back to you. Something that I did not realize was that you can't have a checking account, right? So explain that, because I think that's news to people.
Yeah, so for the majority of cannabis business owners in California are not able to get access to banking. That's the bank's decision. There were a couple federal memos put out which were somewhat rescinded by Sessions, but not really. The banks have enough guidance if they wanted to invest the time into allowing businesses, but it requires them to fill out a bunch of paperwork. And even if we say, you know what, I'm willing to hire a person, a part-time person in your bank to do this for us, I'm sure I could get 2 other businesses on board. They just say no, I'm sorry. Last time I went, Bank of America last time, 6 months ago, said, maybe, we're thinking about it, come back in a year or so. So that's where we are. There are small credit unions in other states that are working with cannabis businesses, but we can't get accounts there. There are also small credit unions like in the Bay Area. If I was located in the Bay Area, I could apply for that, but I'm not. So despite my best efforts, we are unable to get a bank account in Sesame Creek Collective's name.
Chris, let me go to you and then James. Yeah, go ahead.
It is just a brief primer on where the banking situation is. It begins with the fact, obviously, most of these problems stem from the fact that marijuana is still a federal drug under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act. It's still illegal in the country under federal law, and everything kind of flows from that. And one of the things, of course, it being illegal at the federal level is now part of the Bank Secrecy Act, which is what is an anti-money laundering federal law. That results in all the reporting that the banks have to do to do this. So they have to, and then there are compliance with the BSA that they have to do, and it's, acronyms abound, CDD and KYC, know your customer, customer due diligence, and there's various levels of sophistication of this kind of protection based upon the size of the bank and what it does in terms of interstate and foreign commerce. And so most banks refuse to do it because they just don't want to comply with all that stuff, the SARs, suspicious activity reports, things like that. And that has, of course, caused a real problem. It causes people to have to work in cash. It's like one of these, it's the same kind of idea, right? Let's make it illegal so we can stop illegal activity, right? I mean, it's the same kind of mentality that I see working here. So let's make them all deal in cash because that's going to make everybody safer in the public. So when Chelsea, has a backpack and goes to San Francisco to deposit money, she's well off. So the only hope on the horizon, but it's been there for about 7 years now, and this is like the 5th or 6th introductions of these acts. But what's presently pending out there is in the federal level. Actually, there's 3 things pending out there that are sort of interesting. One is what's on its 5th or 6th introduction, which is called the Safe Banking Act, which is a secure and fair enforcement banking act, which would allow for the banks to carve out a safe harbor exception to the BSA and decriminalize this for the banking situations, which would go a long ways towards doing this, but it still doesn't remove it from the CSA, the Controlled Substance Act. But that is currently there. We just had a hearing. There's a bicameral bill. They just had a Senate hearing last week. That was pretty interesting to listen to. Where this goes, no one knows exactly. There's also the States Act, which has also been recently reintroduced. That's a nice acronym for the strengthening the 10th Amendment through trusting states enforcement. And that is one, again, that turns it over to the states and removes it off of it carves out another safe harbor exception to the BSA. And then California has taken one wing at this, and there's a bill, the Senate Bill 930, which is pending. I don't think it could go to the floor, but it carves out a limited state charter bank that is designed as a closed loop sort of thing to not interact with the federal banking system. But the ludicrousy of that kind of situation is that Chelsea could open a bank account, but she couldn't process payroll checks because of the federal tax withholding requirements. So the big news in the federal level is the MORE Act that just was introduced, a week ago, Ryan? Yeah, a week ago by Senator Harris and Senator Representative Nadler. And the MORE Act is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. And that goes the furthest. That's the most radical reform bill that's gone at the federal level because it removes it from the Controlled Substance Act. And it sets up a 5% sales tax, which then goes into a program that has a grant program with 3 programs, focused heavily on giving grants to people who have been hurt the most by the so-called war on drugs with marijuana. So that would be communities of color, things like this. It also requires the federal courts to expunge marijuana convictions, and then on motion, if you're currently under the custody of the system, you could on motion have your a resentencing hearing. So that just went in. Where it goes from here is probably a long thing going on, but the challenges that are facing this industry are not going to go away until the federal government stops what it's doing when it's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt not to work, and stop this and take the next step. That's my opinion. That it should do this.
Let me go to James.
So that's that.
So one of the challenges is, we talked about security where I went down to San Diego, right? Well, one of the big challenges is, and this was when they first opened, was it's an all-cash business with a product that people are willing to kill to get. So we wanted to make sure we had adequate security to protect Chelsea and all her employees and the other dispensary operators up here, as well as the community as a whole. Like I said, my role here is the chief is community to avoid harm, right? I don't want any harm coming to my community, to any of the employees or any of the dispensary owners, any of the business owners, or the community at large. And so to Ryan's point, right, I may be anti-marijuana, but I'm not anti-business, and I have a great relationship with Chelsea and Jeff and Deborah from Ojai Greens, because it's my job to work with them to make sure that we are keeping everybody safe. If I just dig my head in the sand, we're not going to get anywhere. So what I have to do is bury all that and work closely with them so that we can have regulations that make sense. Not having banking for Chelsea and for the others is horrible. The fact that they are an all-cash business stresses me out. I don't like the fact that it's an all-cash business. I wish they could allow banking so that they don't have this giant Target times 3 in my city. Starting with manufacturing now. So back in July of this year, was it last year? Last year, July, the dispensaries could no longer sell products that were not prepackaged. So everything that they have in the stores right now are all prepackaged. So they're buying from a manufacturer and distributor. Comes in the tamper-proof packaging. It's in smaller quantities and not bulk marijuana product, and a whole lot less likely that somebody's going to break in and steal bulk marijuana in these small packages. The moment we allow manufacturing in, which is about to happen, we'll be back in the bulk marijuana business again, because they will all have the ability to create their own products from bulk product they're buying from a cultivator. So we're back into a position where I'm going to have bulk marijuana and cash at 3 dispensaries and 2 additional manufacturing resources, which for me, as a police chief, scares me. We need to have stronger security measures to protect the employees and the businesses, so we discourage people from coming here to try and commit the crime in the first place. Like I said, I'm very confident that we will get them when they leave, but that doesn't stop the crime from happening in the first place, where now I have victims of potentially violent crime and hopefully no homicides as a result.
And also the fact that if a desirable aspect of having regulated legal businesses is to be able to properly and fairly tax those businesses, then driving it into a cash-only situation would seem to impinge upon the ability to adequately track these revenues for taxation purposes.
Hold on one second. I want to alert you back to your cards that are on your chair. If you have a question, jot it down, and in about 10 minutes, a couple of volunteers will come down the ends in the middle and grab those questions.
I'd like to just make one more statement about the sort of unequalness that are facing the industry as well. Chelsea can speak more to this as well. That under federal law, you have a rule called IRC Section 280E. That doesn't allow for a marijuana-related business to deduct ordinary business expenses after cost of goods sold. And you can go through a very easy example and see where that ends up easily, where they can be paying an effective tax rate that's triple what other businesses pay. On top of that, we have the California excise tax of 15% on top of that. And then, of course, you have a complicated, complex, costly, and time-consuming regulatory licensing system. So, again, as long as we have the headache of the federal law affecting this, because even under the so-called Cole memo, which Chelsea referred to, which came out of the Obama administration, and that was, and also out of FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network of the U.S. Department of Treasury, they were saying, we're not going to prosecute if you have a robust system of regulation. So again, that sort of gave everybody the inspiration to over-control in certain respects. But there is taxation. I mean, there are federal income tax rules that also create unfairness. So again, if we want legitimate businesses to safely replace illegal activity, then again, they have a challenge they're facing in order to do that.
No, thanks, I appreciate that. Let me transition though, because we got to get onto these other subjects. Ryan, let me start with you on this one. What lessons can be learned from the growing in Santa Barbara County? Because it's something that has been a very hot topic for us here in Ojai.
Ojai from the very beginning has said we're not going to do cultivation. The reality is that we don't have a lot of farmland inside the city limits. Well, the city council only controls the 4 and about half square miles in the center of the valley. We don't have any jurisdiction over the rest of it. So there hasn't been anyone who has also been clamoring for that type of cultivation, and if you did, you'd probably have to do it inside here, and it would probably be difficult. But we've said from the beginning it wasn't something we were really interested in, but we did want to come up early we have been early to market for the rest of the other areas of the industry. We have studied it. I know that Souza, who's also on the city council with me, and she has been looking into the Santa Barbara situation as well. We learned a lot about that. There was a lot of scent problems that they had in Santa Barbara specifically. In our research was something we found out, but really it's been a topic that we haven't had anyone clamoring for. We haven't seen any interest, and I think it's highly unlikely it would be something that we would look at. But of course, if things may change, we may look at it differently down the road.
Dan.
Fully mitigate. Abatement of nuisances. I think that's the lesson learned. What were they thinking, having no limits and not well thought out restrictions on where and how much could be cultivated? Mm-hmm. I think it's always, I would say, an abundance of caution is needed in multiple levels of where we're going, and that's part of why we, again, squandered 20 years with legal cannabis since 1996. So, back to that graph, there has to be a way to fully mitigate the knowable adverse effects of a new or a resurgent, if you will, industry. And that's not limited to youth access and DUI. It's smells and noises and people hitting Northern California. People came to the grow and tied people up at gunpoint and took all their money. I mean, there's real public safety risks that are that can be mitigated. And I just think we need something more sensible than unlimited development of agricultural land that's adjacent to residential uses. I don't think that's rocket science.
I think that
David, go ahead.
Reasonable efforts. There are lots of things. If the
a little bit louder,
louder. If the legislative body has a commitment to do something, I'm confident that they can. And right now, the legislative body at the federal level commitment is to hamstring the industry. And you're left kind of with the local government to clean up the mess that's been made at higher levels. And unfortunately, there's a limit to what they can do. And for one of the things that you can do in regards to the odor, which is a big issue in Carpinteria, is there are farming systems that are entirely indoors, and there are HEPA systems. I mean, if you really were serious about doing something, you would have good regulations, and that goes back to my comment about the labs need to be better regulated. There should be a pharmacist there. I mean, this has not been taken seriously as a real business, and the city councilman here has said, look, we want to help these along as a business. I'm not sure how many politicians have that attitude.
Mm-hmm. Well, we got 3 on our council, huh, Souza? We've been trying.
So we sort of went past the driving issue, but I feel like we got to at least touch on it before we get into going forward and audience questions. So, James, you and I talked about this a little bit in some detail, but we agreed, tell me if I'm going to get you wrong and correct me. What we're talking about generally, what we're concerned with is impairment, but you have an objective baseline with alcohol, whether the person is impaired or not. Still, there's that baseline 0.08. Now, if they're below that and impaired by your test, that's still illegal. So the cannabis in the bloodstream or the THC in the bloodstream is something there's not an objective test for. Well, fill in the blanks here.
Okay, so for those that are not aware, for drunk driving laws in California, right, there's two sections. There's 23-152A, which just says you're driving impaired on alcohol. And then B, which says that you're 0.08 or above. Now, 0.08 is the amount that they've universally agreed on that shows impairment. The reality is that numbers, to me, it's still arbitrary, because you could have somebody who's a stone-cold alcoholic that's an operating 2.0 all the time, a 2.0, right, a 0.20, that can walk and talk and drive just fine because they're an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. But you gotta have somebody who's a 21-year-old, had their first beer and might be a 0.04, but can't drive a car at all. And they could still be arrested. So you can be arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol under an 08 if you're impaired. And so we have tests, and that's why we do our tests on the side of the road to determine impairment. They're divided attention tests to see how well you do. They're not balance tests, although there seems to be a lot of balancing going on, but there's more than that to the test, right? It's a multi-part test, and we're looking to see a person's ability to follow that, because driving is a multi-part skill. So cannabis is the same thing. If somebody, and prescription pills or over-the-counter medication, somebody could be arrested for driving under the influence of drugs if they've taken cough medicine and they're unable to operate their vehicle safely. A lot of medicines say on there, right on it, do not operate heavy machinery, because they know it's dangerous. It's altering your ability to concentrate and focus on multiple things at once. Now, at some point, maybe we'll come up with a universal standard of how many parts per million it is for cannabis to say this is an amount that if you have this in your system, you're deemed to be under the influence as far as driving goes. But the reality is, right now, we still have the ability to make an arrest for driving under the influence of cannabis, but it's all based on a field sobriety performance test. Now, some of that is in how they drive, right? So I mentioned with Andy when I talked to him earlier is, if I stop a vehicle for a driving pattern, that's part of the test, right? You're not staying in your lane, and that could be because you're texting, and texting is far more dangerous than about any other type of driving. If you're texting and driving, it's like 4 times more likely to crash than somebody who's driving under the influence. Somebody driving under the influence is trying with all their might to drive on the road, right? With all their might, they're trying to pick the lane they're supposed to be in. But people who are texting aren't even looking at the road. So with cannabis and any other drug, right, we're looking to see is there a driving pattern? Do we make a stop for that? If it's something that's a mechanical violation where I haven't had an opportunity to see a driving pattern and it's a tail light out, and then I either observe some symptomology that is indicating that there's something going on, then I go through the process of determining, okay, I'm gonna have you step out and perform some field sobriety tests to see if you're able to operate this vehicle safely, and then make a decision based on that whether or not we make an arrest. Obviously, with alcohol, we have a test that we can do on the side where if they want to blow into it, we can determine where their blood alcohol level is or not. I never used that. I never got trained in that. So mine was all based on either the driving pattern and their field sobriety test, and marijuana currently, and other drugs is the same way.
Dan.
Four really quick points. The Sheriff's Department and other law enforcement in the county have really ramped up the number of highest level drug recognition experts. So it should not be a surprise that there will be more expertise being brought to those field sobriety tests. Second thing is I want to compliment our dispensaries and our local police department. One of the things that we can do is safety messaging, and all of the dispensaries in Ojai collaborate to get DUI prevention messaging and youth access messaging out in every sale, so long as supplies last of the messaging. So I think that's really a testament to Ojai's sort of proactive, community safety orientation, and I think it should be applauded. The two other things, pursuant to SB 94, we have a state-level task force that's looking at the technologies and the science in a very serious, intense way to figure out what will be the 0.08 sort of per se technology, and we have a staff person, and I see him in the back, David Tovar, who's on that state task force for 2021 to come up with recommendations, and it probably will be an oral swab, and the technology will get there, is my point. We will get to a point where there will be some sort of per se, but the overriding thing to keep in mind with impaired driving is, I hate to say it, is driver ignorance. There are so many people who think and say, well, if a doctor recommended or if a doctor prescribed it, then it must be fine. Even with prescription opioids, we have that. So one of the good things that's come out of the collaboration here is that more people are talking about their experiences and the community safety when it comes to impaired driving in the Ojai Valley.
I'd like to comment a little bit, since I'm an expert witness and have testified more than 500 times in court. Most of the last 150 have been with driving under the influence of cannabis, and I can't remember the last time a person was found either guilty of the highest charge or guilty at all. I mean, there was a second-degree murder case I was involved in, and the person was found guilty of recklessly negligent homicide, which was the appropriate decision to reach. The fact of the matter is, at least according to Nick Morrow, an expert witness, former LA County narcotics detective, the field sobriety test is worthless, and in fact there's some studies that show that the results are about the same as chance. There is a new test which I've just been made aware of, it's called DRUID, D-R-U-I-D. The chief may want to look into that. It does seem to have some promise. I also agree with the chief that the thing to do, and the thing that I do when I do my expert witness work, is I look at the police report. How was this person driving? I mean, were they driving more slowly and more carefully? Because that's what the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says is the way you drive if you're impaired. The other thing is, they've been partially quoted the standard warning for psychoactive drugs, and of course, Marinol, THC, the euphoriant in cannabis, is a prescription drug and been on the market for 30 years. And the warning says, warning, don't drive, operate heavy equipment, or engage in dangerous activity until you determine whether or not this interferes with that activity. And I couldn't agree more in regards to mental health is a physician who doesn't tell your patient that you're prescribing some psychoactive drug that interferes with their driving probably ought to report them to the medical board. You know, I mean, that's a serious omission, and it does happen all the time. So about a third of my patients tell me, I wait until I go home before I use cannabis because I think it interferes with my driving or interferes with my thinking. And the other two-thirds say it doesn't. And in most of these cases having to do with cannabis, I'm raising reasonable doubt. I'm not saying the person wasn't impaired, although if I didn't have reasonable doubt, I wouldn't testify because I'd be ineffective. And most of the time, it's sort of like, well, something happened and something must have caused it, and we think this is the something that did. That's pretty vague, and that's why people get off. Not because I'm such a great expert witness, but because of the facts of these individual cases.
James, just briefly.
So that's because we have two different standards and two different burdens of proof. I make an arrest based on probable cause. A district attorney has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They're two totally different standards of proof. And I, as a practitioner in law enforcement for 29 years, I can tell you without a doubt, the tests we do on the side of the road for impaired driving work very well.
I like your answer.
Yeah. One other thing.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Go ahead.
One other thing on that is that, notwithstanding the comments that have been made about the lack of research that's been done and money for research that needs to be done, one of the good things that's happening is that UC San Diego has a cannabis research center where the various new technologies, including the one you're talking about, Druid, are being reviewed, and there's actually a lot of eyes on this and some very smart people trying to come up with something, not only the technology, but a new field sobriety test that's perhaps a marked improvement over what we have now. Not to say it's not effective, but it could be better given where we are with cannabis in our state.
No, thanks. Let me go to Chelsea, though. I want to ask you, because I think it's important. The hemp-based derivatives, CBD hype, talk about that. That's news to me.
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges our industry as a dispensary is facing since the Farm Bill passed, and even before then. The CBD sort of trend is sweeping the nation, sweeping the world. We've been, as a SB 420 collective, before we got a license as a dispensary, had been sourcing and providing CBD-rich cannabis products since 2012 or so. So we've been kind of understanding the therapeutic potential of this other compound found in cannabis for a long time. And we've been promoting that to our patients and educating them, wow, there's these other things in cannabis that are not going to get you high, can you believe it? But they do all these other great things, great for anxiety, sleep, inflammation, all kinds of things. And so what's been happening, though, is that as that word has gotten out and everybody's latching onto this concept of this amazing plant-based medicine that doesn't get you high but has all these health benefits, that's become a launching point for us, another side industry that's not necessarily the cannabis industry, it's now the hemp industry, it's industrial hemp. And so we spend a lot of time trying to educate our patients about the differences in what you might find over the counter at a couple different shops in town, gas stations now. I mean, everybody is selling something CBD infused. And so one of our big challenges is educating people about the differences and what these things are and why it's different from the CBD that we sell in our dispensary. Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I guess the biggest point I would make is that there is no comparable set of regulations attached to industrial hemp products. So when you're buying CBD oil over the counter at a place that's not a licensed dispensary at this point, I would demand to see a certificate of analysis that not only discusses the potency of it, how much CBD is actually in this. Is it tested for heavy metals? Is it tested for pesticides? Is it tested for mycotoxins and all the other things that cannabis is required to be tested for? These things are sold at the same price, if not more than our prices. However, they're not paying any of the taxes that we're paying. They're not paying any of the licensing fees that we're paying. They're allowed to open up anywhere. So you have to ask, well, why am I paying so much for this? It's industrial hemp. Most of it's not grown in California, and very little of it is at this point, if any of it. So it's being imported, it's grown, a lot of it's imported from China. If you're importing something from China, you really need to send it to an independent lab and see what's in that. So buyer beware. And I won't say all of it's bad. There's definitely some good-hearted, ethical people out there that have decided to go through the hemp market because it has no constraints that cannabis does. Obviously, it's a way easier way to make a living right now. But there are benefits to hemp. Hemp oil is a great supplement. It's healthier than, in some ways, has a more wide spectrum. You can talk to this Dr. Bierman than some fish oils, and the omega-3s are more balanced, omega-6, omega-9, all those things. It's a really healthy thing, but it's not the same as getting CBD from a plant medicine at a licensed dispensary. A lot of people are finding that it works for a little bit and now it doesn't work anymore. The main reason is that you need a little bit of THC, you need a full spectrum plant with all the other terpenes and compounds and flavonoids in that to really get the medical benefit of it. And you want to be assured that it's lab tested across the board. Hemp is a bioaccumulator, so it's designed to pull things out of the soil. It's used to remediate soil. So when you're growing tons and tons of it to get this much CBD oil, chances are you're going to have a lot higher percentage of heavy metals in that. And it's also just less efficient to grow industrial hemp to get the amount of oil that you would get to get CBD out of it than you would get from the same amount of cannabis plants. So it's sort of a weird use of hemp. Hemp is really our friend for plastics replacement and fiber, and it does amazing things, but as a medicine, I'm just not representing it that way.
Thank you. So let me go on. There's a million questions, and what we can do is We can have an email or put it on the website, all the questions that we won't get to. We're only going to get to a couple, but let me go for one. What would an education or an educational program for the public look like to you? And that goes to anybody. And I want to add to this question. What would an educational program be, let's say, for Nordhoff High School in our time?
If we're talking future tense, what's not already happening, I think there has to be a discussion of the endocannabinoid system. And I think that's the starting point for basic health education for everyone to understand that we co-evolved with cannabis, and the effects that are experienced are, dependent on our physiology. In the same way that we educate about other parts of our, the human body and our development, we need to incorporate discussion of the endocannabinoid system, and we need to talk about why it is riskier to use early and use often, and not limiting that just to cannabis. That's one part of an educational campaign. That's the sort of the younger. I don't know. I agree with what the doctor said about turning ourselves in pretzels. It is really hard to keep up with, if you want to do an educational campaign, a public education campaign about what's legal and what's safe and what the latest research is, that is almost a fool's errand. We have to take our common denominators and put those into a public education campaign where, where we can have a collective community discussion that promotes health and safety and mitigates all the downsides of what's happening to businesses that are trying to comply. That's the short answer.
I think in terms of the education, that if one could separate the wheat from the chaff on the internet, there are a number of organizations that have got very scientific, very accurate kinds of 12-part series that go into, cannabis, cannabinoids, the endocannabinoid system, terpenes, and then the problem with reaching youth is that certainly people my age have no credibility with them. I do have credibility with my son, but he's 26. We need to be honest with them so that they'll believe us about the two most dangerous drugs that are out there, alcohol and tobacco. And if we sort of shade things on cannabis, we're undercutting our message. I guess the first thing, and I'll shut up and let Chief do
a little bit louder.
You need to talk into your mic.
The first thing that I would say is we need to teach doctors about the endocannabinoid system so that they understand cannabis is a medicine. I mean, I'd say about 100 doctors in southern Santa Barbara County that referred one or more patients to me. I'd like to think it's because they think I know something about this, but I think it's because they know that they know very little, and they want to at least expose their patients to somebody who knows a little bit more. This is the chance to flash my book here called Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine, and it's perfectly appropriate for high school kids, and it goes into the endocannabinoid system. It's short, it's something that they can comprehend, and you talk about the side effects in that context so that people understand, why am I going to have this side effect? And you know what I'm saying? It makes it something that they can incorporate into their thinking.
Thank you. James. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Chris, go ahead.
I think about the educational programs and what we try to do, and I'm speaking just as a parent now. When my oldest is approaching 40, so it's been a while since I've been involved in this discussion, but it hasn't changed that much either. And I think back my own high school experience when they showed us Reefer Madness in our class, and the whole place burst out laughing. I thought, well, this is not quite the result they wanted from this. But I think that, clearly telling them they can't do it, telling them it's just bad for them, and whatever it is, I think it's proven to be an ineffective parental tactic. And that's the number one where the education starts with the child, because One, of course, is the example you do. So if they get stoned every day, it's not a very good thing that they're not going to do that. Or actually, that may help them not do it. Like, I don't want to be like Dad. My dad's a stoner. But the other point is that it's just open, honest, reasonable communication that takes place in everything you do. Because without that trust that's built up through the child's lifetime, they're not going to listen to you. So, but if you sit there and you're a high school parent and you're going to go, well, my child's not going to take drugs or have sex or do any of these things, you're kidding yourself. So you have to have an open, honest, reasonable discussion about this that doesn't judge, it just talks about it, and it shows that you care and that you're there for them on this. And there are dangers in all aspects of life that we do. It's just there. So I think that it's just some kind of extended, formal education program. I don't know if we'd want to spend a lot of time and money on that personally. It just hasn't ever proven to be effective.
Thanks, Chris.
And I would just say that I agree that it starts at the home, right? This is a parent conversation with your child on decisions that your child is going to make, and we've talked about, the brain's not fully developed until they're about 25, and so there's a lack of action and consequence understanding. There's also a big lack on being able to retain the information for longer than a couple hours, right? You can have that conversation with your child. You only have it once. Well, they didn't hear it. You got to have it consistently, right? And that's about that open and honest communication about everything that they do in life. The number one thing you can do as a family is have dinner together, right? And that dinner time is a time not to be texting one another, but actually have a conversation and be able to reinforce the values that you have in your home, things that you want your children to be aware of, things that you want them to think about, decisions that they make and consequences that might come with it. And what you'll find is when you start to then have to talk about things that are really important, you're not just sitting down for the first time when something bad has happened to talk to your kids. You've talked to them all along. This is just part of the conversation that you're having. And so when they do make decisions, they can come to you and say, I need some help with this. I think I did something wrong, or I'm having a problem, and they feel confident in sharing with you in their experience so that you can give them good advice, because we have that experience to hopefully give them good advice. They're not always going to listen to us because that's part of growing up. They're going to make some decisions on their own that we're not going to be very happy about. How we react to that is going to be very important of whether or not they're going to ever come to us again. They say something you don't like and your jaw hits the floor, they're not going to ever come to you. You need to make sure that you're prepared to keep the jaw up, listen to what they have to say, and then provide really good advice, and hoping they listen to it next time. And hopefully they don't learn from mistakes that you've made or your friends have made or family members that you've seen have made, and so they don't go down a bad path. But I think that to ask a school to do that and own that is improper. The school's got a lot on their plate already. This is something that starts in the home, can be reinforced at home. There's a lot of information now that is widely available on any internet source that's credible. I know that Dan had mentioned the one that's through behavioral health. There's information that parents can get, and once again, I still think we're so far behind on where we should be on really what the challenges are, good and bad, as it relates to marijuana or cannabis, that it's very difficult to have a conversation about if you do this, X is going to happen, because we don't know what X is. We don't know what that is yet, and because we have not had the proper testing with the different levels to have a clear understanding of what we're up against.
Let me go to the next question. We're almost out of time. There are very specific points about traffic and accidents, just to clarify. One is when the dispensaries opened in Ojai, did we see an increase in traffic that has abated since Port Hueneme opened? Or has there been a change at all, traffic-wise?
To my knowledge, we have not done a traffic study that's specific to how many cars have been hitting Bryant Circle, and if that changed from the time that our dispensaries opened and when Hueneme opened. Chelsea she was the very first operator open in the valley, so maybe she could speak to whether or not they saw an initial increase and then decrease when Hueneme opened. Also, I think initially we were medicinal only for about a year, and then they were all allowed to go recreational, but I think by then Hueneme had come out recreational, so I don't know if there was an impact, and Chelsea could probably speak to that.
Did business go down for you guys when Hueneme opened? Not really.
No, because really Hueneme attracts a lot of people just coming from a different area of the county. Most of the people in Ventura are coming here. Okay. And Santa Paula and Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, the adult use dispensaries in Santa Barbara still haven't opened yet. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would say in general I've noticed increase in traffic. It's my turn in and out of Bryant Street takes longer. Mm-hmm. For sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wasn't sure if that was the dispensaries or caravan outposts. You know, I'm not sure.
If they're
They seem to
having a
coincide.
party, it's them, but on a day-to-day
Yeah.
basis, it's probably us, yeah.
Dan.
I just wanted to say about, the question wasn't about impaired driving, so I can save it for later.
Okay, well, actually, it's the next parts of the question. In general, since recreational use has been legalized, has there been, we sort of talked about this, maybe not this pointed way, an increase in accidents where there is a DUI, that could be a mix of alcohol and cannabis, just in general, an increase? Or
So
not?
that's a perfect segue.
Okay.
So some of you know, some of you may not know that if you are arrested and convicted of a DUI in Ventura County, there are 5 county-operated DUI programs that you'll probably be attending. It's a dual authority. You got to get good with the court. You got to get good with the DMV. So one of the things that our office does is collect post-adjudication data from people who go through the program. And we have about 2,200 people at any given time across our 5 sites. And we collect information about the events and circumstances that led up to their arrest. And I'm very happy to say that this Place of Last Drink survey, not so aptly named, has been tracking cannabis, self-reported cannabis use. Again, this is post-adjudication. This is not a field interview. And what I can say is that we do have baseline data. This is one of the things that's encouraging is we will have this along with a range of other county-wide indicators that we can track over time and see. Because what we saw with Washington and Colorado was there was a lot of gnashing of teeth that they couldn't compare antes y ahora, right? And so we set out to make sure that we had a set of indicators where we could, when we get 4 or 5 years down the road, compare before and after. And so among young adults under the age of 35, we do see more people reporting the combo of alcohol and cannabis on the date of their arrest. Whether cannabis contributed to the observed driving behavior or the symptomology or what happened in the field, that's a separate issue. But so we do see a slight rise in the number of young adults who report using cannabis and alcohol together on the day of the arrest. It's correlational, it's not causational, but we can track things over time, and that's part of a larger set of data that you expect from your government to track indicators so we can see how things are trending.
Thank you.
Can I say a couple of things about that? One is that I think it's very hard for a defense attorney to defend somebody who has drunk alcohol and smoked marijuana on the same day. I'm not saying that it always causes impairment. I'm saying that the optics are terrible and that you have a bad time with the jury, regardless of what the alcohol level was on the THC level. The other thing is
Closer to your mic, please. Closer. Yep.
If you take a look at accident rate, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says there's no impact on accidents from use of cannabis. And I wrote an op-ed piece, which I won't bore people with, where I compared California and Texas, a marijuana state to a non-marijuana state. And there was a 20% decline over a 4-year period in California and a 1% decline.
You got to be close to your microphone. Yeah.
20% decline in fatalities in California, 1% decline in Texas. Now, that's just, one thing I picked out of the air. I wasn't trying to cherry pick. It just happened to demonstrate the point that if you are impaired, you drive slower and more carefully, and that may explain it. If you don't replace your alcohol with cannabis, then you're sort of defeating the purpose, in my opinion.
Just very briefly.
Real brief. Just there's a way to prevent this all, right? You don't drive. There's a lot in today's technology world. You can call any number of rideshare services. You can call Dutch here locally. You can call a friend and say, "Hey, can you come pick me up?" That may not have been widely available years gone by, but today, there's really plan ahead. If you know you're going to go out and have a drink, you know you're going to go out and smoke weed or use an edible or whatever, and you don't want to take that chance of getting put through the system, call a friend, call a ride, and don't drive.
Super quick, just show of hands. Would anybody not support, let me not do a double negative. Would anybody object to changing the classification of cannabis away from a Schedule I substance. So not wanting it, you want it to stay the same and not change. Raise your hand. That could be for anybody.
So I'm going to give a caveat, right? It's already legal in California, so for me, the benefit of taking it out of a Schedule I allows me to have a bank. It allows me to have it tested and have it have studies done. And so if we've already accepted the fact that if the federal government is going to allow states to decide on their own what they're going to do, then let go of the constrictions on it so that we can continue down the path of regulation and finding out what this drug is really all about, or this plant is all about, and the benefits from it, because we may be missing out on some really great benefits.
Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, last question. Is there improved purity of the product since legalization? And if the answer to that is yes, could, hold on, sorry guys. Could improved purity make a difference in research results and the true effects in the developing brain?
Yes, I would say yes. The stuff we have is the cleanest we've ever seen. I mean, some operators have been growing without pesticides organically forever, so this is nothing new, but this keeps everybody else in line. And it also keeps, some of the carpinteria rage right now is not just about the odor, it's about the avocado growers that can't spray their things anymore a certain period of the year because it impacts the cannabis crops. Even though they had a deal worked out between them, cannabis said, okay, we'll shut our walls down and you can spray for 2 weeks, or I don't know all the details, but cannabis is much cleaner now than it's ever been. And I think to me that's been the biggest benefit of regulation.
What I'm hearing is cannabis is cleaner than avocados. Is that correct?
It is.
Just kidding.
Yeah, and the genetic research is happening. I mean, there's patents going on like crazy right now. I think GW Pharmaceuticals is gonna snap up a bunch of those. But there's, I think there's actually an enormous amount of research being done right now, not necessarily in the U.S., but I think the reason I got into this industry was because I felt that it was the next frontier of medicine.
So when you look at, anytime you've changed the substance, right, whether it's now cleaner or more potent or whatever, it's going to change the absolute dynamic of what that product is able to do and what the impact of it is going to be. So because of those changes, it's absolutely important for us to now have it tested, and not just tested, but have it studied at those new levels so we can get some accurate data of what we're currently facing.
Thank you.
But, in terms of studies and long-term studies, the federal government did have 15 people who were receiving 7 to 9 pounds of cannabis a year. And there's still 4 of those people still alive. And there was a study that was done back in 2004 and found that other than their underlying condition for which they were using cannabis,
Closer to the mic, please.
there was no abnormalities.
Okay. So, last word.
The Department of Health and Human Services has approved clinical trials for the use of cannabis in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we've moved away from the binary war on drugs or anything goes. And that third way is where we need to take advantage of local control and local goodwill to get it right. That's all I'll say.
We're out of time. I love it when these panels go so quickly. I want to say 3 quick things. Thing number 1, if you want to receive our communications and do not now, please sign up on the email list out there, and please write legibly, or I'm going to send it to the wrong email address. Number 2, we are launching our free community seminars again, The Foundations of Our Republic, which will be at the Ojai Library starting Monday evening, August 12th. That's meeting twice a month for an hour. It's free, and you get to go through all of the documents, starting with the Declaration of Independence and ending with Letter from Birmingham Jail. This will be videotaped and on our website in just a few days, so you can watch it or send it along. Finally, we are kicking off a series on education, a series of panels. And on August 25th, in this room, we'll have a panel, What is Education For? That's with public, private, many purveyors in the valley, and it'll be a long series covering all those topics. So let me thank the panel once again. Phenomenal. And have a great Sunday evening. Thanks.